What were Bernard Bosanquet's main ideas concerning social philosophy?
Humans, said Bosanquet, can only achieve their individual goals within communities, both individually and collectively. We all wish for those things that produce harmony where once there were conflicting desires. On a community level, this is the general will. Being ruled by the general will results in liberty. The general will is the foundation of the modern state that has as its aim the actualization of what is best for all of its citizens.
What was Immanuel Kant's Copernican revolution?
Just as Copernicus changed the center of our universe from Earth to Sun, Kant relocated the basic principles and categories of reality, as studied by science, from the external world to the mind. Like John Locke, 1632 to 1704, he began with an examination of the powers of the mind, and an aim to reject metaphysical claims that could not be rationally justified. He posited a human rational necessity to understand real experience in space and time and a practical need to live with other rational beings, seeking the principles that could fulfill those requirements. In 1770 Kant argued in On the Form and Principles of the Sensible and Intelligible World that our knowledge of space and time is only about appearances, but that we are still justified in making limited claims about what lies behind those appearances. This was the foundation for what became known as critical philosophy. Kant's revolutionary claim was that we have a priori knowledge of both space and time. Because they are the forms of our perception, space is the organization of experience in the outer world, while time is the organization of experience in the inner world. This was followed by the two editions of his Critique of Pure Reason, with his prolegomena to any future metaphysics published in between to respond to criticism.
What is Kepler famous for?
Based on the principle that causes needed to be sought for observed planetary motions, both regular and exceptional, Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630. Posited both a force between planets and the Sun and also a force to propel the planets. Isaac Newton, 1643 to 1727. Was to show that a principle of inertia could be used instead of the force to propel the planets. Kepler's most famous contribution was the discovery that the planets moved in elliptical rather than circular orbits.
What was tragic about Schlick's death?
After the Nazis came to power in Germany and Austria, many members of the Vienna Circle fled to the United States and England. Schlick remained. Although not Jewish, he was distressed by what was then happening in Germany. While walking up some steps at the University of Vienna to teach a class on June 22, 1936, Johann Nelbach, a former student, confronted Schlick with a pistol and shot him. Schlick died of a chest wound. Nelbach was convicted but soon pardoned, after which he became a member of the Nazi Party. Although Schlick was not Jewish, logical positivism was condemned as Jewish thought by the Nazis.
What was Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative?
Kant is usually interpreted to have two formulations. First, act so that the maxim of your action, or the generalization describing it, can be willed by you to be a general rule, to be followed by all rational agents. In other words, only do those things that you as a benevolent, rational being can will that everyone do. The test of a categorical imperative is what happens if everyone follows it. Something that has good consequences in a particular case might not have good consequences in all cases. For example, if the maxim is obey traffic rules, and you come to a red light with no other cars in attendance, you may not drive through it, even though the consequences in this particular case would be benign. Or, to use an example of Kant's, if the maxim is not to lie, and a madman is looking for a friend of yours whose whereabouts you know, you may not lie in this case. Because overall you can't benevolently will that everyone be permitted to lie whenever the consequences are good for them. To take another example of Kant's, you may not take your own life. No matter how miserable you are, because you categorically can't will suicide as a good action.
Who is Julia Kristeva?
Since arriving in France in 1966 from Bulgaria, Julia Kristeva, 1941, has achieved international recognition for her writings about women in the psychoanalytic tradition. Her work is considered multidisciplinary, encompassing art criticism, philosophy, and cultural critique. Kristeva's primary theoretical contribution has been a distinction between the symbolic aspects of language and what she calls the semiotic, a psychic level of meaning based on a child's relationship to its mother. Primary human desires are attached to the semiotic, which is based on the biological rhythms of the maternal body. Although the semiotic eludes symbolic translation,
What were Maimonides' main intellectual contributions?
after Maimonides, 1135 to 1204, and his family fled forced conversions in Spain, they settled in Cairo, Egypt, in 1165, where Maimonides was the physician of the vizier of Saladin, c. 1138 to 1193, he wrote 10 books on medicine, but it was his works on Jewish theology that represented his most important contribution to Judaism. Book of the Commandments treated the 613 laws from the Old Testament. Commentary on the Mishnah explained the practical purposes of the old rabbinical code. And Mishnah Torah, codified Talmudic law in 14 volumes and retains its classic status to the present. However, it was Maimonides' philosophical treatise, Guide of the Perplexed, that had direct influence over a broad range of Western philosophy.
Why was Montaigne important?
Michel Ichem de Montaigne, 1533–1592, the essayist who became mayor of his hometown of Bordeaux, France, resurrected the ancient Greek skepticism of Sextus Empiricus, 160–210 c. With some reliance on Cicero. Although Montaigne lived during the end of the Renaissance, his ideas set the stage for much thought that would follow during the scientific revolution and early modern philosophy. In the history of ideas and philosophy, he is therefore much more than a Renaissance figure.
How are dogs like cynics?
The English word cynic comes from the Greek kyn, which means dog. Diogenes of Sinope thought people could learn much from dogs, who were not ashamed of their bodily functions, not picky eaters, and did not care where they slept. Dogs neither worry, nor care about academic philosophy, and they know immediately if someone is a friend or an enemy. What's more, dogs, unlike humans, are honest. Like a dog, Diogenes had no use for family structures, social organizations, politics, private property, or good reputation. He is said to have masturbated in the agora, marketplace, and replied to those who insulted him by urinating on them. He also gestured at others with his middle finger. Plato described him as a Socrates gone mad, because of his contempt for convention and knowledge of philosophy. Many considered Diogenes a man of wisdom. Alexander the Great once sought Diogenes out, when the philosopher was bathing in his wine barrel, which he did often because of a painful skin condition. When Alexander offered to give him anything in the world he wanted, Diogenes replied, "Please get out of my sunlight," or words to that effect.
What was Noam Chomsky's argument against behaviorism?
Chomsky, 1928, objected on the grounds that the speed with which a child learns a language and demonstrates an ability to form correct new sentences, even without hearing grammatically correct speech, implies that this language ability has not been learned. Behaviorism was fundamentally a theory that all human knowledge and behavior, including language use, was learned.
What was Michel Foucault's method for forming his cultural criticism?
Foucault studied institutions and ideas by understanding their histories. In the course of that anthropological archaeology, he often pinpointed the emergence of new forms of human discourse and personal identity. In the case of sexuality, for example, Foucault argued that new forms of power create new forms of sexuality, as do new practices of observation and medical diagnosis. One of Foucault's most enduring contributions was to demonstrate how many human traits and practices that are believed to be natural are in fact the effects of social and political institutions that exert unexamined power on individuals. At the same time, the individuals are complicit in remaking themselves to conform to institutional expectations. A primary example would be ideas of gender such as athletic ability in women. Before the second half of the 20th century, women were believed to be unable to participate or excel in sports due to natural limitations. Foucault is famous for having claimed to invert Plato, c. 428 c. 348 BCE, who had said that the soul is imprisoned in the body, meaning that our natural physical needs and desires oppress our higher spiritual selves. Foucault thought that the soul is the prison of the body, meaning that our ideas shape our physical existence.
What happened to Henry David Thoreau's hut?
A replica of Thoreau's hut can now be visited. It is adjacent to Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts. Visitors can also walk around that 3-mile circumference, across which Thoreau wrote that he liked to have big conversations with his guests. But none of this is the real thing. After Thoreau left his hut to stay at Ralph Waldo Emerson's, 1803–1882, house, it was moved around Brooks Clark Farm as a structure for storing corn. It was finally placed in the northwest pasture of the farm to memorialize Thoreau and left there until 1867. Although the windows were gone by then. In 1868, the roof was taken off to cover a pig yard. And in 1885 the floor and some other wood from the hut were used to make a shed off the barn. The remainder of the hut was then taken apart to replace planks in the barn. Others say that these boards were used to remodel the farmhouse, to build a broad community and support democratic social interactions through writing and public speaking. But both Thoreau's privileged love of nature and the pragmatist's more common touch represent a cultural sea change from much of the thought discussed in the salons, drawing rooms, and formal church-like architectural settings of Europe.
What was Henry David Thoreau's philosophical contribution?
Henry David Thoreau, 1817–1862, was a naturalist, writer, school teacher, and pencil maker. He invented the pencil with an eraser on its end. He was born in Concord, Massachusetts, attended Harvard, and then returned to Concord. He was not a political reformer but is famous for his civil disobedience in not paying the poll tax. He felt it supported slavery and the Mexican-American War, both of which he found objectionable, and for helping runaway slaves escape. Thoreau is best known for the 2 years he spent in a hut he built on Walden Pond. An experience he describes in Walden, 1854. His lifestyle there and protest against materially driven lives of quiet desperation set an aesthetic ideal for many American intellectuals in generations to come. Thoreau's love of nature and ideals of simplicity were in themselves a form of revolt against industrial life and have been reclaimed in intellectual revolts against post-industrial life. However, Thoreau's striking intellectual contribution is not the ideal of roughing it in nature. Because his time at Walden Pond, punctuated as it was by frequent visits from his literary friends, as well as his own habit of walking back into town, was hardly a withdrawal from society. Indeed, the hardships he endured scarcely compared with the hardships of pioneers and homesteaders farther west, who lived in rural poverty out of necessity rather than choice. By contrast, Thoreau set a different example for a different American group of strivers. He combined a naturalistic aesthetic of simplicity with cultural criticism and intellectual creativity. This life of the mind in the woods stands in stark social class and regional contrast to the genuinely hardscrabble background of several of the early 20th century pragmatists, as well as with their efforts
What were John Stuart Mill's views on marriage?
Mill concluded that human virtue flourishes best in friendships between equals, and that was his ideal for marriage. By a real enrichment of the two natures, each acquiring the tastes and capacities of the other. As a utilitarian, Mill justified this ideal of friendship between equals for marriage by claiming that it would allow half of the human population to make contributions to civilized life, which had not yet been made. He also believed that women had already demonstrated distinctive moral strengths and altruistic impulses, so that their participation in civic life and the professions would advance civilized values in general.
What was Charles Peirce's pragmaticism?
Peirce's starting point in his pragmaticism was his activity and self-identification as a scientist. Peirce thought that philosophy was philosophy of science and that logic was the logic of science. As a pragmaticist, Peirce is best known for two articles, The Fixation of Belief and How to Make Our Ideas Clear, published in Popular Science Monthly, under different titles, in 1877 and 1878, respectively. In these works, he defended science as the best way to overcome doubt and presented the pragmaticist idea of clear concepts. He claimed that concepts, or the meanings of scientific terms, must have cash value. The cash value of a concept is the difference it makes in experience to have the concept, compared with not having it. The entire meaning of a clear concept lay in its consequences. The consequences meaning of a scientific concept were possible observations under conditions that could be specified. That is, the concept had to generate predictions, and it doesn't matter if the predictions were accurate or not, just so long as it could predict something that would happen.
What is the causal theory of meaning?
This theory was first developed by Paul Kripke, 1940. Keith Donnellan, 1931, and Hilary Putnam, 1926, in the 1970s. There used to be a distinction between denotative and connotative, or intentional, with an S, which is different from intention with a T, meaning. Denotative meaning was the thing or types of things in the world to which a word referred. Connotative or intentional meaning was the conditions of application of a word or the definition of the word in other words. According to the causal theory of meaning, also known as the causal theory of reference, there is a causal history that makes proper names the names of the individuals they are, something like a baptism. Natural kind terms, such as water and gold, work in much the same way. To take an example, the term water designates the natural H2O. If a substance were called water that was not H2O, it would not be water. Putnam famously said of meanings in this regard that they just ain't in the head. Articles by Kripke, Donnellan, and Putnam on this subject appear in Naming, Necessity and Natural Kinds, 1977, edited by Stephen P. Schwartz.
How do we know the one?
Plotinus, 205 to 270, taught that the soul can know the one by becoming one with it, which he called ecstasy, surrender, simplicity, touching, or flight of the alone to the alone. This reascension of the soul, which has been described as a union with God, in the Christian sense, was experienced many times by Plotinus. To prepare for it, Neoplatonists practiced virtues and Platonic dialectics, which included the study of mathematics.
What religious issues are involved in environmental thought, pro and con?
Some of the critical perspective derives from a Christian view embedded in Western political philosophy that God gave the earth and everything on it to humankind to rule over for our use. Only humans have the spark of divinity that justifies intrinsic value. Nonetheless, many religious groups have proclaimed an obligation of benevolent stewardship over parts of the earth.
What was the Sedgwick's interest in the paranormal?
Henry Sedgwick helped found the Society for Psychical Research in 1892, and his wife, Eleanor, was an active participant. The Sedgwicks believed that the work of society could help confirm religious claims, such as life after death. They believed that an afterlife was necessary as a motivation for morality in this life. However, their investigations were inconclusive. Even though Eleanor believed that Henry communicated with her after his death in 1900.
What were William Whewell's main ideas?
Whewell posited certain fundamental ideas, such as space, time, cause, and resemblance, which enabled unconscious inference so that we could structure and relate our sensations in ways that resulted in our perceptions of objects. He thought that each science has a distinct particular fundamental idea that makes sense of its subject matter. For instance, the idea of space for geometry, cause for mechanics, and substance for chemistry. The fundamental idea of a science can be further modified to fit the requirements of that science, such as the idea of force as a modification of the idea of cause in mechanics.
How did Imre Lakatos' research program reconcile Popper and Kuhn's work?
Lakatos, 1922 to 1974, described a scientific method to both allow for progress and explain how science had developed. Instead of talking about theories, he introduced the notion of a research program, which consisted of both theories and accepted research practices in a given field. Every research program has a core, or protective belt, of claims that could not be falsified. Degenerating research programs have growing protective belts and fail to predict new facts or create new projects for discovery. They survive by adding ad hoc hypotheses. Progressive research programs are able to support new projects of discovery that do not produce vast amounts of falsifying data requiring revision of the core. They do not significantly rely on ad hoc hypotheses. The way that Lakatos reconciled the discrepancy between Popper and Kuhn's account of science was to shift ground from the static relationship between facts and theories to the dynamic nature of scientific practice. Popper's view was that scientific truth changes when theories are falsified, whereas Kuhn thought that theories were not falsified so much as overthrown. Lakatos made scientific practice, rather than beliefs about the truth of theories, his subject.
How did Gottlob Frege attempt to reduce mathematics to logic?
In his Foundations of Arithmetic, 1884, Frege argued that logic, or the laws of thought, are not descriptive of how we think and that words do not have meaning in isolation but only within context. Then in his two-volume Basic Laws of Arithmetic, 1893 and 1903, Frege began his project in earnest by showing that every predicate determines a class that can be described logically. For example, red is a predicate and red determines a class of red things.
What is pragmatism?
Pragmatism is a distinctively American philosophy that originated in community discussion groups and came to define the philosophy department at Harvard University during the late 19th century. While not as scientific in perspective as some philosophy in Europe during the same time, it represented an effort to think in a practical way.
What did Plato mean by the divided line?
What Plato meant by the divided line is explained by Socrates in the Republic. Now take a line which has been cut into two unequal parts and divide each of them again in the same proportion. And suppose the two main divisions to answer, one to the visible and the other to the intelligible. And then compare the subdivisions in respect of their clearness and want of clearness. And you will find that the first section in the sphere of the visible consists of images.
Who was Alexius Meinong?
Alexius Meinong, 1853–1920, was born in Lemberg, Austria, and studied philosophy with Franz Brentano. 1837–1917, who set him the task of reading David Hume, 1711–1776. This resulted in two early books on Hume, the first on abstraction and the second on relation, which appeared as Hume's Study N in 1877 and 1882, respectively. Like Brentano, Meinong is considered an analytical phenomenologist. Unlike those phenomenologists in the so-called continental tradition, he applied the rigors of logic to introspection. He established the Institute of Psychology in Graz, Austria, where he was a professor. Meinong is best known for his theory of objects and values, and his principal publication is On Assumptions, 1902.
Was Luce Irigary's speculum of the other woman socially relevant?
Yes, and it has also had a tremendous influence on students and scholars of French feminist philosophy. In the context of the women's health movement in the United States during the 1970s, It expressed part of the spirit of the gynecological aspect of women's liberation. Women began to rebel about the fact that there were so few women doctors and that male doctors treated their reproductive and childbirth issues in repressive ways. Women began to talk more openly about their feelings of shame about their own bodies. Members of some women's collectives began giving themselves and their friends gynecological examinations. And others, without prior medical training, taught themselves how to administer abortions. At the same time, the practices of natural childbirth, childbirth without medication, and nursing, which until then had been the only resort for many poor women, were advocated for privileged women, for the health of both mothers and babies. These examples of women taking responsibility for their health were motivated both by an ideology of rebellion against patriarchy and the goal of improving women's health. Since the 1970s, feminist advocates have pointed out that clinical medicine has traditionally been based on the male body. Some diseases have different symptoms in men and women, for example, heart disease. At this time, female doctors are commonplace, particularly in the practice of gynecology. And there is greater attention, overall, to women's health problems. Historical information on the 1970s women's health movement can be found at CWLU Her Story Project. The online history of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union is at http://www.cwluherstory.com.
Who was the Marquis de Sade?
Dinatien Alphonse François de Sade, 1740–1814, was a French nobleman and revolutionary best known for his shocking pornographic works Justine, The Misfortunes of Virtue, Juliet, Vice Richly Rewarded, 120 Days of Sodom, The School of Licentiousness, Incest, and the Crimes of Love. In an age that was not strongly focused on vice and sin, he managed to spend over 30 years of his life incarcerated in an insane asylum, as well as in prison, mostly on account of his writing. The term sadism is based on his name.
Who was Henry Moore?
Henry Moore, 1614–1687, was the great-grandson of the martyred English Chancellor, Sir Thomas More. Henry enrolled in Christ College, Cambridge, at the age of 17, and remained there his entire life. He became a fellow in 1641. His distinctive mission was to eradicate, or cure, atheism and enthusiasm, which he called two enormous distempers of the mind. He sought to convert philosophers to the Christian faith, as he understood it. And his interests included Neoplatonism, reports of witches and ghosts, science, and René Descartes, 1596–1650, philosophy. He differed with Descartes, however, in insisting that animals have souls. He attacked Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, and Benedict de Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, for their presumed atheism. He was a tutor to Cambridge Platonist Anne Conway, 1630 to 1679, and deplored her enthusiastic conversion to Quakerism. He is said to have coined the terms Cartesianism and materialist. Henry More's writings included a history of the English Jesuits, translations, and his life and doctrines of our Savior Jesus Christ, 1660.
What did Søren Kierkegaard deem his main vocation in life?
Kierkegaard felt his main vocation was to reintroduce Christianity into Christendom. For him, Christianity was a way of existing. He thought that only humans existed, because they have internal reality. In contrast to God, who has external reality. Faith for him was an inward leap in answer to one burning question about God.
What was Scottish common sense philosophy?
It was the realist view of human knowledge put forth by Thomas Reid. 1710 to 1796, that what we know are real objects in the world and not our ideas, as claimed by David Hume, 1711 to 1776.
What was ironic about Maurice Merleau-Ponty's last lecture?
Merleau-Ponty died suddenly of a stroke while preparing to give a lecture on René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. He repeatedly returned to Descartes' split between the mind and the body in composing his own philosophy. He did not accept the Cartesian split, but sought to address the mind and body as a united whole. Merleau-Ponty thought that a person's own body, le corps propre, should be in its personal, individual, lived reality, a scientific subject. It is one's own body that makes consciousness corporeal. He wrote, "Insofar as I have hands, feet, a body, I sustain around me intentions which are not dependent on my decisions and which affect my surroundings in a way that I do not choose." Clearly, Merleau-Ponty's stroke proves this point because it was not something he chose, but definitely something that conclusively affected not only his surroundings but the possibility of his even having those surroundings. What's ironic is that he made his point by having a stroke, which is very different from making a philosophical argument.
How can this be?
Freya's explanation was that there is a difference between sense and reference. Reference is the actual planet Venus, in this case. But sense is how the planet is referred to by the term morning star, i.e., a bright object in the eastern sky before sunrise. Thus, the morning star does not stand for Venus itself, but for the sense of how Venus is presented. This is why the two sentences that appear to be equivalent really are different. It explains why it is not informative to say that Venus is Venus or that the morning star is the morning star. But it is informative to say that Venus is the morning star.
What is Julia Kristova's idea of the object and the nature of women?
Kristeva has emphasized the rejection of mothers by both male and female children due to male-dominated cultural patterns that render the mother herself abject. Which is to say, totally other, disgusting, and monstrous. Kristeva thinks that the solution to this problem requires a rediscovery and healing of narcissism in women's psyches and an acceptance of adult love between women. However, Kristeva rejects the label woman as a universal term, and has refused to define women. She apparently believes that every woman is fundamentally different in how she is a woman or what being a woman means. As she wrote, it is there, in the analysis of her difficult relation to her mother and to her own difference from everybody else. Men and women, that a woman encounters the enigma of the feminine. I favor an understanding of femininity that would have as many feminines as there are women. Kristova's main theoretical writings are, About Chinese Women, 1977, Desire in Language, A Semiotic Approach to Literature and Art, 1980, Powers of Horror, an Essay on Abjection, 1982, Revolution in Poetic Language, 1984, and New Maladies of the Soul, 1995.
Who was Johannes Scotus Iri Eugenia?
Johannes Scotus Iri Eugenia, c. 810 to 877, also known as John Scotus Iri Eugenia, was a Christian rationalist. Literally, his name means John the Irishman, the Irishman. King John the Bold called him to his Palatine school to translate the Pseudo-Dionysius. This document was falsely attributed to Saint Dionysius, d. 268, a convert of Saint Paul. Although it was in fact written by an unknown Neoplatonist, Eriugenia's translation was initially a success. Building on its main ideas, he constructed his own system, De Divus Ioni Naturae. His basic premise was that logical reasoning ought to be compatible with Christian philosophy. This meant that the teachings of the Church Fathers could be criticized, if necessary. More heretically than that, it left no room for faith in divine creation and salvation. Eriugenia's treatise was condemned by Pope Honorius III, 1148–1227, in 1225.
What other continental traditions are new to Western philosophy?
Recent decades have seen renewed interest in African, Japanese, Chinese, and Indian philosophies among Euro-American philosophers. Some of this work has been called comparative philosophy because it seeks to relate themes that are well established and well developed philosophies in their continents of origin to traditional interests in Western philosophy. Japanese, Chinese, and Indian philosophies admit to the comparative treatment because they have long, well-established textual traditions. However, African philosophy is a less clear case. Not because it fails to treat issues that in the Western tradition would without doubt be considered philosophical, but because much of it has endured through oral traditions. Still, a broad recognition of African culture and its historical civilizations, after the 1960s, led to the Euro-American perspective of Afrocentrism among some members of the African diaspora.
What did Pope Honorius III consider heretical about Johannes Scotus Eriugena's treatise?
In De Divis Ioni Naturae Eriugena presented a Neoplatonic view of the world and cosmos that was also pantheistic. The Catholic Church did not accept pantheism, which held that God was everywhere in the world, because he was supposed to be separate from his creation. According to Eriugena, we cannot ascribe any natural quality from our own experience to God. That view was not a problem for the Pope. The problem was that he described the created world as emanating from God in different stages. God created ideas or Platonic forms, and these created perceptible objects. The perceptible objects could not create anything but instead would ultimately be one with God. Which meant that God was all in all, part of a circle that ended in himself.
What is materialism?
In a general philosophical sense, materialism is the doctrine that only physical, material things are real. In a political Marxist sense, materialism is the doctrine that economic conditions and transactions determine the course of history.
What was William James' pragmatic ethics?
James thought that values require beings with emotions and wants. Judgments of value are objective when care for one another results in a standard for a community. This results in a shared or common world. Moral choices determine our character. Besides decisions connected to physical pleasure and pain, there are higher ideals that should direct our future experience, and, if necessary, be modified by that experience. Moral progress results when more inclusive ideals are substituted for less inclusive ones. Nevertheless, all ideals are only provisional.
What is sense knowledge?
Sense knowledge is information gathered through our senses, such as sight, touch, hearing, and so forth.
How did Richard Rorty illustrate relativism to his audience?
Rorty, 1931 to 2007, practiced a highly sophisticated relativism that allowed him to present a position that his audience would agree with, and at the same time show how that position could be plausibly contested by those who held a very different position that was unacceptable to him and his audience. Concerning fundamentalist religious beliefs, for example, he taught views opposed to them with apparent strong commitment, and at the same time tried to show how his perspective was deeply offensive and even counterproductive in changing the minds of those who held those beliefs.
What is early modern philosophy?
Early modern philosophy is mainly centered on intellectual activity in the 17th century, with some overlap into the early 18th and late 16th centuries. Early modern philosophy was modern in its concerns with epistemology, or the nature and justification of human knowledge. The fact that the scientific revolution was by then taken for granted, and a new acceptance of logical argument and fact-based reasons as necessary ingredients for the practice of philosophy. However, what made it early modern was the continued importance of religious issues. The background social need for philosophers to assert a belief in God, the continued reaction against Aristotelian scholasticism, and the unstable political context prior to the existence of strong nation-states.
Lewis Hegelians apply their philosophy?
The St. Louis Hegelians tried to apply their philosophy directly to current events. They were very proud of St. Louis. In contrast to Chicago, due to an error in the 1870 census, the St. Louis Hegelians, along with other residents of the city, were thrilled by the statistic that the population of St. Louis was greater than that of Chicago. On October 8, 1871, the day of the Great Chicago Fire, believed to have been started by a kick to a lamp from Mrs. O'Leary's cow, although overall conditions were extremely dry and inflammable. Snyder asked Brockmeyer what he thought of this disaster. Brockmeyer's reply, note, Snyder spelled Brockmeyer's name as Brockmeyer, according to Snyder, was: Chicago was the completely negative city of our West and indeed of our time. And now she has carried out her principle of negation to its final universal consequence, she has simply negated herself. The positive result of that negative is bound to arrive, but not over there in the same place again, but here, here in our St. Louis. But alas, the 1880 census put the population of St. Louis below that of Chicago. The St. Louis Philosophical Society hired a mathematician from Washington University to check the census figures. He told them that the 1870 census had been in error and that the population of St. Louis really was 350,000 compared to 503,000 in Chicago.
Who was Jane Addams?
Jane Addams, 1860 to 1935, was the first woman public intellectual in the United States. She was a close colleague of both John Dewey, 1859 to 1952, and George Herbert Mead, 1863 to 1931. In 1931, Addams was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her progressive public activities in beginning the settlement house movement. The settlement movement involved locating places for assisting members of impoverished immigrant communities, directly in their neighborhoods. Addams began the services of Hull House with art appreciation classes and quickly developed a program of education for youth. Child care, instruction in domestic skills, and adult education. She was only recovered as a philosopher and feminist in the late 20th century. Her main works include Democracy and Social Ethics, 1902, Newer Ideals of Peace, 1906, 20 Years at Hull House, 1910, and Second 20 Years at Hull House, 1930. The Long Road of Woman's Memory, 1916, and Peace and Bread in Time of War, 1922.
What was John Stuart Mill's view of logic and scientific methodology?
Foremost, Mill argued that deductive logic does not depend on intuition for its proof, but rather on internal consistency. The foundational assumptions or axioms of all sciences are based on experience. Even the shared scientific axiom that nature is uniform or law-like is proved through simple enumeration of confirming examples, that is, through induction. More specific causal explanations do no more than summarize necessary and sufficient conditions. A necessary condition is always present when the effect occurs. The effect is always present when a sufficient condition is present. For example, a bullet to the brain is sufficient to cause death in most cases. But it is not necessary because people die from other causes. Or, oxygen is necessary to cause fire. But it is not sufficient because fire requires friction and combustible material, as well as oxygen. Mill also thought that the basic principles of arithmetic and geometry could be proved by induction. He agreed with Isidore Marie Auguste François Xavier Comte, 1798 to 1857, about a unified view of the social sciences, whereby the laws for more general sciences could be derived from what is known about more specific sciences. For example, observations of individual human behavior could result in a science of psychology. And observations of individual psychology could result in a science of society or sociology. It should be noted that much subsequent theoretical work in mathematics and social science did not find Mill's ideas useful.
What was Robert Nozick's response to John Rawls?
First, Nozick, 1938 to 2002, held that rights were inviolable. Second, he argued that a minimal state could develop without violating rights, but that a Rawlsian state could not because of the difference principle. Nozick argued that any state based on the principle of helping the disadvantaged required the violation of property rights where property had been acquired through free exchange.
What are the three waves of feminism according to feminist philosophers?
The first wave began on the eve of the French Revolution with Mary Wollstonecraft's 1759 to 1797 writings and continued until women in both Great Britain and the United States were granted the right to vote in 1918 and 1920, respectively. After women gained suffrage in the United States, the women's movement seemed to go into a dormant period, perhaps because until the end of World War II progressive thought was concentrated on socialism and communism. However, in the middle of the 20th century, the publication of two books began what many view as the second wave. The French existentialist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir's 1908 to 1986, The Second Sex, 1952, and Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, 1963. Betty Friedan, 1921 to 2006, was an American writer and left-wing political journalist and activist. In 1957, at the 15-year reunion of Smith College, an institution for women, she interviewed her classmates who had graduated in 1942. Many had achieved the approved social ambition of a husband, home, and children, but they were dissatisfied with their lives and in some instances agonizingly unfulfilled. Friedan argued, in ways that resonated throughout American society and Europe, that women as human beings needed education and meaningful work, mental stimulation, and fully adult responsibilities. By the 1970s, further development of Friedan's ideas found expression in the third wave, the women's liberation movement was associated with the following achievements. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination in employment on the grounds of gender, as well as race. The U.S. Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade in 1973 legitimized the right to abortion based on bodily privacy. These legal innovations combined with the pill, birth control medication, provided a new degree of sexual freedom. Huge increases in women's employment outside the home, and access to higher education. Women entered the professions in unprecedented numbers, and the rest is history, in the sense that it is now taken for granted by American society that women should have opportunities equal to men's.
Who was Imre Lakatos?
Imre Lakatos, 1922 to 1974, main contribution to the philosophy of science was to reconcile the work of Karl Popper, 1902 to 1994, and Thomas Kuhn, 1922 to 1996. He was born Imre Avram Lipschitz to a Jewish family in Debrecen, Hungary. His mother and grandmother were killed at the Auschwitz concentration camp. Lakatos, which would be written Lakatos Imre in Hungarian, studied mathematics, physics, and philosophy at the University of Debrecen, changing his name to Imre Molnar to save himself from the Nazis. He was a communist during World War II and took the name Lakatos as a tribute to the Hungarian general and Prime Minister Géza Lakatos. He studied at Moscow State University, but then was imprisoned for revisionism. From 1950 to 1953 for ideas that reinterpreted Marxist doctrine in a way that Marxist authorities considered to be undermining to their official views. He then fled Hungary after the 1956 Soviet invasion. Lakatos earned his doctorate at Cambridge University in 1961 and lectured at the London School of Economics. Lakatos' major works include Proofs and Refutations, 1976, which is based on his doctoral dissertation. The Methodology of Scientific Research Programs. Philosophical Papers Volume 1, and Mathematics, Science and Epistemology, Philosophical Papers Volume 2, 1978.
Was John Stuart Mill a socialist or a capitalist?
In applying the principles of utility to government and social institutions, Mill recognized the productive consequences of free markets. But he thought that public ownership of production might benefit a greater number by eliminating the extremes of poverty. He believed in democratic government, provided that citizens were well informed and it was not a simple majority rule based on emotions.
What was the analytic/synthetic distinction and why did C. I. Lewis need it?
Analytic truths are true by definition and tell us nothing about the world. Synthetic truths are about the world, but they can turn out to be false. Along with this distinction is the a priori/a posteriori distinction. A priori knowledge is known without, or before, experience. Whereas a posteriori knowledge can only be known after, or as a result of, experience. Empiricist philosophers traditionally hold that there are no a priori synthetic truths. and they have tended to assume that what is analytic is also a priori, and what is synthetic is a posteriori. Lewis' main philosophical tool, in accounting for both ordinary experience and scientific knowledge, was to distinguish between the a priori and what he called the given. Quite simply, he thought that our knowledge and experience was the result of the interplay between the a priori and the given. There is something brute in our experience that we have no control over, but we make sense of it by projecting a priori principles and categories onto it.
Teresa, and what were her main ideas?
St. Teresa of Avila, 1515 to 1582, entered the Carmelite order when she was 22. And there she sought guidance in how to pray until she was 47. In 1560 she became part of the reform movement among the Spanish Carmelites. Her main works were the Vita, Life, which was her spiritual autobiography, and Way of Perfection, and the Interior Castle. Her main project was to help readers surrender to the Divine Trinity. Teresa held that mysticism developed in stages. In her life, she says that the soul is like a garden. First, weeds need to be removed, and then water must be carried from a well. The senses must be subdued to minimize distraction during this initial labor of prayer and meditation. The prayer of quiet in the second stage is like irrigation with the help of a water wheel. And in the third stage a condition of contemplation is achieved, which is analogous to having a running brook through one's garden. By this time, the senses no longer function normally, and the soul wants to withdraw from the world and unite with God. In the fourth stage, this union is achieved. In the Interior Castle, Teresa uses the analogy of a castle with many rooms to describe a life of contemplation. After 6 early stages, the soul comes into the direct presence of God. In what way was St.
What is German idealism?
It was the philosophical perspective developed in the 19th century that reality is not physical but psychic, or mental. Its main author was George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831. There were also British and American versions of Hegelian thought.
What are some key facts about John Dewey's life and career?
Dewey was born in 1859 in Burlington, Vermont, where his father was a grocer. He attended the University of Vermont and then taught classics, science, and algebra at a high school in Oil City, Pennsylvania, and then in Burlington, Vermont. Unsure of his future direction, but encouraged by former teachers, He applied to the new graduate program in philosophy at Johns Hopkins University but was turned down for a fellowship twice. Dewey finally borrowed $500 from an aunt to attend. He thereby became part of the first generation able to obtain PhDs in philosophy in the United States. Dewey's teachers at Johns Hopkins were philosophers George Sylvester Morris (1840–1889) and Charles Sanders Peirce (1839–1914), and psychologist G. Stanley Hall (1844–1924). At first, Dewey was very interested in Hegelian ideas of organism, that the living being interacts with its environment, and that society is an organic whole that can be viewed as an organism. After writing a dissertation on Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, he taught at the University of Michigan from 1884 to 1894. At this time he became interested in public education and progressive politics, as well as psychology. In 1894 Dewey became chair of the Department of Philosophy, Psychology, and Education at the University of Chicago. At Chicago, working with colleagues, he began to develop activist social theories. This resulted in the 1903 Studies in Logical Theory, which was dedicated to William James, 1842–1910. Dewey had a national reputation when he left Chicago for Columbia University. The Journal of Philosophy, published by the Columbia Philosophy Department, became an outlet for his ideas and a forum for discussion of them over the decades. Dewey lectured in Tokyo, Peking, and Nanking, and studied education in Turkey, Mexico, and Russia. In retirement, Dewey chaired the 1937 Mexican Commission investigating charges against Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, which produced a report, "Not Guilty." He also defended Bertrand Russell in 1941, when Russell was denied a teaching opportunity at City College, New York, because of his political ideas.